So you do think another global financial crisis will happen?
Oh yeah, it's inevitable. Not because of the financial sector. Again, economists are responsible. They simply assumed that climate change would only affect businesses which were outdoors. So economists didn't believe climate change was going to matter. When reality starts to strike and asset prices are going to plunge in one of many, many ways, this is existential. We don't realize stability of the climate was essential for the evolution of human civilization. We're destroying it without even understanding it. And that is already happening on a grand scale. That then means we've set off processes we can't control that are going to amplify what we began. Most of the people I'm channeling in this are professionals, researchers in climate change, and they're terrified and they can't get the message through. There's a range of estimates coming out, but the most pessimistic said 95% chance of it failing between 2025. And when that happens, effectively Europe becomes uninhabitable.
You're not defined by where you come from.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big message that I always want to tell people. Like
you have to be able to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
When you grow up in ends, you don't realize it when you're confident, but you have an audacity to do things that ordinarily most people wouldn't be willing to do.
Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I have a special guest in the building. I'm your host, Atto. We have Professor Steve Keen, who is a distinguished research fellow at UCL, the author of 3 books, The New Economics, a manifesto, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis, and Debunking Economics, and has about 80 referee papers on topics including flaws in the economic analysis of climate change, the causes of financial instability, and much more. Professor Steve Keen, how are you doing today?
Good to be here.
Cool. Yeah. You know what? It's so interesting. We were supposed to be recording this yesterday and we had a bit of a issue, let's say, had a bit of technical difficulty. So I'm quite excited to be having this conversation with you today. So obviously I described you. Who would you say, Professor Steve Keen is?
Well, I began as someone who, the first person in my family to go to university. So I had no picture I'd end up doing what I'm doing now. I really didn't. And I got to university doing a degree in arts and law. And then we're specializing in economics, so that was my real passion. And then halfway through first year, realized that economics was full of nonsense. I had a particular theory explained to me which just pointed out the foundations were wrong, and I've been a critic ever since. Led a student revolt when I was 20 years old, 1973. Became an academic in the 80s after working in school teaching, overseas aid, journalism, computer programming, conference organisation, and then went back to teach others why the mainstream theory was wrong, never expecting to be a leader in the development of an alternative, but I ended up being the leading critic and one of the leading developers of alternative economics. So life is, I think one of my favourite lines is from a John Lennon song, which I think is Pretty Boy. He says, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. So that's been my life.
Interesting. I want to hear more about this student revolt. What happened there? Why did you lead a student revolt?
Well, I was in my first year, as well as doing economics, I was doing mathematics. And I saw the huge contrast between quality in mathematics and what was being done in economics. And I also was taught this flaw in the theory very early on in my career. You're not supposed to learn this stuff in first year. We had a dissident lecturer who gave us this, what's called the theory of the second best. And that just turned upside down all the argument about deregulation and getting rid of trade unions and all that stuff, which is believed by mainstream was nonsense. And then I found a whole lot of other stuff as well. So I found a group of students who, all of us were disgruntled about what we were being taught. We were the leading honours students. We were the guys topping the honours course and stuff like that. And we were disgusted with the nonsense we were being taught at the same time. So this was when the Vietnam War was still happening, and Australia had conscription at that stage. So you faced conscription to go and fight for freedom in Vietnam. And then in the end of 1972, a progressive government was elected and they pulled us out of Vietnam immediately. So all this energy that had been going into protesting about the war was suddenly redirected into protesting about what you were being taught. And it was a long story, but there was a group of a pair of young researchers in the philosophy department who wanted to put on a course called Philosophical Aspects of Feminist Thought. They were blocked by the professor. The staff supported them, and the staff then called on the rest of the university to strike over that. And that the economics department went on strike as well. About 40% of the university was on strike over this issue. And we then struck over as well as supporting the feminists in the Department of Philosophy, we also said we want to change the curriculum in economics. We want more than just one school of thought. We want criticism of theories as well as, reading out the catechism, which is what the textbooks amounted to. And I wasn't the one who suggested it, but we held what we called the Day of Protest in 1973, mid-1973. And in that we gave alternative economic approaches. And the professor challenged us, if you think you can do better, why don't you design a course, which we then did. That became the Department of Political Economy. And it was a fabulous experience. I mean, students these days are so burdened down by having to pay fees, by needing to get a degree for a job. Unlike when we were going through, the unemployment rate in Australia when I was in that particular year was about 1.2%.
Oh my gosh!
You had no fear of not getting a job if you didn't get, if you didn't focus on your grades. I still got good results, but I wasn't putting in the effort because I didn't believe what I was being taught. So we had about I'd say of the 1,200 students in the economics department, probably 700 were on strike.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
The staff were on strike as well.
That's so
it was quite amazing stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so let's talk a bit about your story. So, were you born in Australia?
I was born in Sydney. Yeah.
Born in Sydney, right? And did you grow up Sydney like most of?
Oh yeah. I mean, I was in. Sydney born. My family, typical story. We're all ultimately migrants.
Yeah. And
mine were a combination of Scotland, England, Ireland, and France.
Okay.
Which is quite cute. But I had no knowledge of that when I was growing up, of course. So I grew up in a Sydney suburb. Went through a Catholic school. Ended up rebelling against the religion as well as everything
oh my
else.
God, you're an absolute rebel.
And then I only became an academic when I turned 1/3 of a century old, like 33 years and 4 months. And at that point, I was in a job in an unusual part of the government. It was we were trying to build like a Swedish social democratic system inside the Labour Party, and we were being shot down by the Economists and conventional thinkers in the Labour Party. We were blocked, nothing was happening, and I just got sick of it and thought the only way to take on the mainstream economists who were blocking every move we were trying to make was to take them on the breeding ground, but like Sarah Connor's, you've got to go and kill the Terminator, not just kill the Terminator, but kill, what was it called, Genesis? So I went back to university to do my master's degree when I was in my mid-30s, and first of all worked on something I realised after the student revolt. We had all the students had a discussion group on Marx. So we were reading Karl Marx, and I couldn't swallow the labour theory of value. And then in reading it, I found a superior theory inside Marx based on his philosophy that contradicted the labour theory of value. So I did that in my master's degree. And then I did the PhD in the early 1930s, not the 1930s, on the financial crises, what causes financial crises, and building on the work of a guy called Hyman Minsky. You might have heard of the term a Minsky moment.
Yeah.
Okay, well, he was the person after which that was named, and he never managed to build a mathematical model of his theory for a lot of reasons. I did, so that was my PhD thesis.
Okay, so your PhD was building a model
of financial instability.
Okay, and why it happens, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Financial crisis. If you think, not if we, because I'm not the expert, you are the economist. If you think another one's going to happen, and how that will happen, and if it potentially can be prevented, because I think it's quite interesting for us to understand that, and especially that you've gone through a few cycles as well.
Oh yeah,
you've actually gone through a few cycles and experienced it, and you've experienced it from the point of view from as an economist. So I think it's going to be very interesting. So so you grew up in Australia, right?
Yeah.
I guess, how did you find it? in Sydney?
Oh,
What's
look, it was fabulous, physically a fabulous place to grow up because it was, I've got used to the weather in the Europe these days, but Sydney, a bad day in winter was 10 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
Over, that was the minimum.
Wow.
I think if you didn't hit 17, it was a really bad day as a maximum. So sunshine all the time. I was out playing tennis. From the age of 9 on, I was playing up to 5 days a week tennis. I actually considered a career in tennis at one point.
Interesting.
Didn't do it, but that was a possibility. So it was brilliant outdoor life, beautiful. The sky is beautiful. Rather than you guys wonder where the sun is, and you get this dark blue sky with it's just intensely physical, but intellectually a backwater in a lot of ways, as I realised since I came over here. So very enjoyable to grow up there, and but culturally boring because at that stage, like as I was born in 1953, so it was well before any of we started to get European migrants turning up. So most of my I had a few Anglo friends, but most of my good friends were the Italians, the Lebanese, the Egyptian, Greek, etc., etc. I just liked the other cultures, and the food was as boring as batshit. Steak and 3 veg was normal meal, and there were no restaurants to speak of. Really quite dull. And then, as well, when the Vietnam War ended, as well as Australia pulling out her involvement, you then had the collapse of the Vietnam and then the invasion of Kampuchea by Vietnam. And it was 2 waves of refugees came out of that. And at the time, a guy that we regarded as reactionary at the time, Malcolm Fraser, who was then Prime Minister, was what I call a principled conservative. And he said, anybody who's being forced out of that, we contributed to the war, still anti-communist attitudes as well. Anybody who wants to come to Australia is welcome. So a huge influx of Vietnamese and Chinese, and the whole food culture changed overnight. And now it's just a fabulous place to go for a meal. So, and then the cultures are sort of a mix. It's much more mixed with Asia than it was when I was very Anglo-Saxon, very white. And of course, we've always neglected and dismissed, maltreated the Aborigines. Very few Australian whites know any Aborigines at all. I was lucky to know a fair number. But it was culturally quite conservative. And then bang, this transformation came through. And it's now a very multicultural society. So I quite enjoy that.
I love that. Okay, so the path to becoming an economist, how did that happen?
I was the first member of my family ever to go to university. So I had no idea of how good I was versus the professors, and I thought, even though I took them on intellectually over teaching economics, I didn't think I had what it took to be an academic. And then, so I went off to school teaching after I finished doing my degree. I didn't want to do law. After having studied it, I realized it was absolutely not for me. So I finished the law degree but didn't do it. So I did teaching for a while. I've got a bit of a fiery temper, so I threw the English master out of the library one day when I was school teaching. Long story. And that led to me deciding I better leave teaching. So I got a job in overseas aid, which was called the Freedom of Hunger Campaign. And the idea there was to promote awareness of third world issues in the media in Australia. This is well before the internet, so everything was newspapers and TV and radio. And it was successful at doing that in various ways. And then the organisation was run by fairly unimaginative people, so they wouldn't support one of my next ideas. So I went off and did that myself, which is running seminars between Australian journalists and journalists in Asia. So I ran a seminar in Beijing with Australian journalists meeting with Chinese journalists, and I brought Southeast Asian journalists out to Australia. Couldn't get continued funding for that. Ended up being unemployed for a while. Got into computer programming. So I learned how to program in databases. And then this is the very early days of computers. This is well before the IBM PC, let alone Macs and all that sort of jazz. So I was using a piece of software called Perfect Writer, Perfect Calc, Perfect File it might have been called. And it got trashed in one of the leading journals. When this days the computer magazines were really big, the early days, and I wrote a reply writing a letter saying, you don't understand the software. This is why it's so good. Opened the next copy of the magazine, and there was my letter as an article. So I ended up being sucked into working for one of the rival magazines. So I was software editor for about 15 years. So I got to see virtually any software package I wanted to see. I could get sent to me within 4 hours, and I could then review it for the magazine. And that's where a lot of my knowledge came from. But then I got a job in the government promoting a sort of social democratic approach to industrial policy. We got blocked by the mainstream economists, and I just realised at some point whether I've got the ability to contribute in original work or not, I've got to go and fight these back where they are, which means going to university. And I was very lucky, I must say. There's little serendipity things that happened throughout my life. So a woman who was very active in one of the other overseas aid charities, I think she was in what thing called Action for World Development, which was a Christian thing. She was the secretary to the head of department in the economics at the University of New South Wales. And because she supported me, the professor was a lovely guy, took her advice and appointed me. So I got this gives you an idea how different universities were back then. I got a full-time position as a tutor while I was doing my master's degree.
Wow.
Okay. You can't even imagine that. You've got to have a PhD in publications. Yeah. It's much, much tougher these days, and in a bad way. So I got the job. I was tutoring 12 hours a week, and then still doing the software reviews, and then I've decided to focus on Marx. And I found a flaw in Marx that I made a convincing case that it was true, and I got 2 papers published in academic journals. Then I discovered Minsky's work. That was through the master's I was doing, and I realized that Minsky had attempted to model this idea of financial instability with the wrong mathematical foundation.
Yeah.
He wasn't. I'd worked just by knowing mathematics well enough. I was doing maths while I was doing my studies, a PhD and master's degree. I did a full honours degree in mathematics while I was doing my PhD. And I knew that the correct foundation, found that, and then built a model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And I did that back in 1992.
Yeah.
It wasn't published until 1995, but it basically predicted what came after.
Okay.
Which was a hell of a shock to me, as well as every.
Really? So you were shocked about the outcome?
Yeah, because the model, I built a model using what's called complex systems these days.
Yeah.
So basically, if anybody knows, if I'm talking any engineers watching, it's a set of coupled differential equations. And I took a set of equations that gave you a cyclical economy when you just had workers and capitalists in the model. That was actually derived from Marx, long story, but the guy who built it, named Richard Goodwin, built it as a birthday present to Marx 100 years after Das Kapital. So I took that and added a financial sector. So you have, when capitalists wanted to invest more than they had in profits, they had to borrow money. If they got so during a boom, they'd borrow more than they invest. They'd increase investment by borrowing more than they had in retained earnings, and during a slump, they'd pay it off. And I put it together, and I got a chaotic system out of it.
Okay.
And the remarkable feature of it was that I was just trying to explain how you could have a debt crisis. Okay, and there's no preconception that there'd be any particular sort of path there. Just you get to a too high level of private debt, and then you have a debt crisis and collapse. But what happened was, on the approach to the crisis, the cycles diminished. They got smaller, then they got bigger on the other side. And I showed this. When you did it in 3 dimensions, it looked like an hourglass. But you sort of climbed up the hourglass and then went inside the very narrow neck and then up to the top, and then it broke down with high levels of debt. And I showed it to one of my econometrics lecturers, and remember him saying, "Steve, if you've identified anything in really existing capitalism, we're in deep, deep trouble." Well, then what happened after that from 92 forward, the cycles in the economy, particularly the American economy, started to diminish.
Yeah.
And neoclassicals thought, this is great. They called it the Great Moderation, and they took credit for it. I looked at it and thought, holy shit, my model's turning up on the real data. But for a lot of reasons, when I wrote Debunking Economics, that got me involved in 3 or 4 years of fighting with conventional economists over the other original work I did in that book.
Yeah.
So I took my eye off the debt data, and then I got asked to do a This is a longer answer than you wanted, but useful. I got asked to do be an expert witness in a court case on predatory lending.
Okay.
And the only reason you can convince a judge not to enforce a contract is that it has deleterious impacts upon third parties. So I used that argument about rising debt and how that could cause a crisis. And then I had to look at the data again, and I thought, holy shit, the level of private debt, ratio of private debt to GDP was growing exponentially in both Australia and America.
Yeah.
I thought this can't continue. When it stops growing, when the ratio stops growing, the rate of change, the boom caused by capitalists borrowing more than they earn to invest will end, and you'll have a precipitous collapse. You'll go from credit adding to demand to credit being negative and subtracting from demand, and that'll cause an economic crisis which will be bigger than anything since World War II.
Yeah.
And that's what happened.
Okay.
Not in Australia.
Not in Australia, in the US.
Not in Australia. And I copped the blame for that.
Yeah.
I got ridiculed for it in Australia because it didn't happen. The reason was I was warning like crazy about it. I got onto the leading national affairs program.
Okay.
I got half the program dedicated to me when they normally did 6 items. I was literally half the show. And the next day they interviewed the Prime Minister, scared the shit out of him over my ideas, which he'd already aware of, and they'd announced a stimulus package a week later.
Okay.
And the stimulus package included restarting the housing bubble.
Okay.
So that sort of, I've got this negative reputation in Australia because I said it was going to happen and it didn't
and then
happen.
It happened. Okay.
It didn't happen.
But then you kind of prevented it by talking about it.
Yeah, I know. Okay, I got criticised because I stopped happening but they did the wrong thing. I mean, Australia's housing bubble is now a total social catastrophe. But then the rest of the world I was recognised as having warned of the crisis.
Yeah, which is how I found you, because you were one, I think it was one of 6 or one of 8 that predicted the 2007-2008 global crisis. Actually, I wanted to just clarify a few terms that you mentioned. Yeah. Private debt. When you say private debt, is it us consumers when we talk about private debt, like us borrowing money, like loans, credit cards? Is that what you refer to as private debt?
When I modelled it, it was specifically just firms borrowing money.
Okay, so companies borrowing money from banks and etc. Okay, so in your model, basically these companies, the amount of debt that they were borrowing compared to how much the economy was producing was higher than normal or something like that.
Or what happens is the basic logic of the dynamics is that you first of all have a cyclical system. So workers want wage rises, but their capacity to get the wage rises depends on the level of employment. So low level of employment, they've got to accept wage cuts. Okay? High level of employment, they'll start demanding wage rises. What that gives you in itself is a cyclical model, because capitalists will want to invest when they've got a high rate of profit. They get a high rate of profit when the workers' share is low in this model. Therefore, they invest a lot. So a boom happens. Because the boom happens, there's more workers with a job. They start demanding wage rises. The rate of profit falls, so capitalists stop investing, and you go back into a cycle. I added into that was a model where the model actually assumed capitalists invest all their profits. Okay. No banks. And I thought, well, that's unrealistic. Capitalists invest more than their profits during a boom and less than their profits during a slump. So I simply added that in, and then, of course, you've got to borrow money and pay interest to the banks on that. So you've got 3 classes: workers, capitalists, and bankers. And then what happens over time is that the boom gets more extreme because of the borrowed money. It becomes bigger than it would be without it. You get workers' wage rises increasing at the same time, but you're also paying more interest to the banks. So you get an accelerated boom. And then when you go into the slump, you've got workers accepting wage cuts, or in the real wage, falling because of the slump, but you're still paying interest to the banks. And you've got to pay some of it off. Okay. So you get back to the same relative profit share, and you've got a higher level of private debt and a lower level of workers' share of GDP, but the same outcome for capitalists in terms of the rate of profit. So you get a high level of debt each time it ratchets up like that, and each time the workers fall a bit, then the debt's higher, and that's what gave you this accelerating process over time. And it turned out this is what's called an emergent property in a complex system. I didn't put this in the model at all. I simply had effectively you can derive my model from definitions.
Yeah.
And what happened was the increasing share going to the bankers because of the higher debt level didn't come out of the pocket of capitalists in terms of even though the ones doing the borrowing, it came out of the income share going to workers.
Yeah.
So a high level of private debt for bankers means a lower share of GDP for workers.
Okay.
That turns up on the data as well. But then ultimately you get to the point where the booms start to get more and more extreme. And then at some point there's such a level of borrowing going on that the fall in workers' share when the slump happens isn't enough to counteract the compounding of debt, interest on debt, and you get debt goes to infinity compared to GDP, employment wage share collapses, you're in a Great Depression.
Okay.
That's what happened in the Great Depression.
Yeah.
It was only turned around by government spending. So and that's, if you look back historically over the 1800s in America, they regularly had experiences of this nature. So debt causes financial crises. It's private debt that matters. And that's looking at just good debt in the sense that corporations are borrowing to finance investment, et cetera, et cetera. What we have these days is bad debt as well. People borrow to buy housing, but borrowing to buy a house drives up the price of houses.
Yes.
Okay, and a more expensive house doesn't help you pay off your debt unless you can sell it to somebody else who takes on more debt than you do. So that's actually like what's called a Ponzi scheme. It only works as long as somebody else borrows more money than you did. Keep on going. And that's what's been driving house prices for the last 40 or 50 years around the world, one of the worst being the UK. Okay, so the level of private debt level of household debt has gone from 20% of GDP to 80% of GDP.
Wow.
That's what's actually driven up house prices. So with a vision like that, my model was the best of all possible worlds, where all the money was borrowed for productive investment. What we have in the real world is most of the money is borrowed for speculation on asset prices, and that speculation, because you make something more expensive, doesn't make it more profitable. You're not making goods and services. You're simply driving up the price level of assets relative to consumer goods and wages. And ultimately that falls over. The trouble is our governments get involved in a bad way. And the governments, particularly when you have, people who are landlords, most of your parliamentarians owning 2 and 3 and 4 homes and more, they want to keep the bubble going.
So they want to keep the housing bubble going.
They lend, what do they call, help to buy and stuff like that. Yeah. I call that help to sell, because you give more money to the borrower. They then go to the bank and leave it up by a factor of 5, and they give the money to the vendor. And so what we've got, which is incredibly bad, is that our governments have been supporting the housing bubble more than they've been supporting productive investment.
Okay. Interesting. Well, we're gonna definitely deep dive into that. I just wanted to clarify one other term from you. So, capitalist. When you say capitalist, is that also referring to businesses?
Oh yeah.
You say capitalist, not people, not individuals like us. Right?
Yeah, I mean, when I had when you're building a mathematical model, you've got to make some abstractions.
Okay.
So the simple abstraction I had was I identified the firms with the people who owned the firms.
Okay.
Okay,
that makes sense. Okay, cool. So let's talk about the financial crisis, right? At a high level, for people that don't even understand or know what that is, and I guess maybe they might have been young. I think when 2007, 2008, I would have still been in college around that time, actually.
Yeah.
So at a high level, what is a global financial crisis?
Okay. That's when it was the phenomenon of rising private debt was a global phenomenon. Okay. And it comes out of the fact when you deregulate bankers. Okay, I'm relatively in favour of deregulating the industrial sector in various ways. Regulations can get in the way of innovation. Sometimes they cause innovation as well. But you deregulate the finance sector, they're going to start a bubble, because the easiest thing to do is to lend money against property. A banker will normally, making a loan, will try to secure it against an asset. Okay, so when you lend to a firm, you secure against the assets of the firm. That's okay because the firm is producing output. But when you lend to a household, you secure against the household. So you've got a mortgage. You know what the word mortgage means in Latin?
No.
Death contract.
Death contract.
Okay. Now, the UK used to have a rule that didn't let banks lend for housing. You had to borrow from a building society. Okay? And that was changed by Maggie Thatcher in 1982, 83. That's when your bubble began, because when you borrow money from a building society, you've got to be a member of the building society, you have your deposits there, and then the building society will lend out a fraction of those deposits to people who want to buy. You've got to be in the building society for a few years, et cetera, et cetera. For that reason, there's no money creation. The building society has a bank account at a bank. You've got a bank account at a bank. When they decide to give you a loan, their account goes down, your account goes up. There's no money creation. So there's no additional money, monetary demand in that sense for housing doesn't rise in the aggregate. But when you go to a bank says, you want to buy that place in Chipping North, that's great. Here's £1 million, which goes into your deposit account. And by the way, you owe us £1 million. That increases deposits and it increases loans at the same time, and that creates money. So you've then got the extra demand for housing comes out of money creation by the banks, and that drives up house prices.
Yeah.
So that's what gave us the over-the-top bubble in 2007, because there was obviously a housing bubble in America.
Yeah.
But there were ones in the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Spain, Portugal. Everywhere except Germany pretty much had a housing bubble.
Wow.
All financed by the same mechanism of banks lending money, creating money because they lent the money, that then adding to demand for housing. And it's actually the rate at which that accelerated is what gave you rising house prices.
Wow.
And then when the acceleration stopped, the whole thing plunges down, and you went from positive credit. So credit is the change in the change in private debt is called credit by accountants. So debt's what you owe in dollars. Credit's the change in the amount you owe per year. Okay?
Yeah.
So that, in America's case, that peaked at 15% of GDP, equivalent to 15% of GDP in 2007. It fell to minus 5% by 2009.
Oh my God.
That's what caused the crisis. You have more extreme examples. Spain, the rate of change of private debt hit 40% of GDP and fell to minus 20.
Okay.
So the huge boost to demand, huge slump to demand.
Yeah.
And that slump, when credit goes from positive to negative, that's what causes minor economic downturns when credit doesn't go negative, but causes crises when it goes negative.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously you were right. You predicted 2007, 2008 financial crisis. You were right. And then you wrote a book, right, in 2017. But that was before, obviously, what we've had now, COVID.
Yeah.
Obviously the issue in 2020 as well, that came down with that, with, governments across the world shutting down things, and obviously economy stalling. I guess, what do you think? Do you think that we'll have another global financial crisis, given obviously your book was 2017 and now 2020, things have changed slightly? In
the book in 2017, I said I don't think we'll have another financial crisis. What we'll have is what I call credit stagnation.
Okay.
Because to have a crisis, you've got to have two things: a high level of private debt, and it's got to be rising rapidly.
Yeah.
That gives you your boom. And I said one of the problems of having mainstream economists in charge of government policy, in their theory, private debt doesn't matter.
Okay.
They leave the bank. This is, most people who haven't done an economics degree would find this ridiculous. Most people who have would think it's natural, and that is that economists have convinced themselves that money only has what they call nominal effects. It doesn't affect the real economy. So when they do their models of the economy, macroeconomic models, they leave the banking sector out. They don't have banks or debt or money in their models at all. So they don't know it's important. They didn't even know what caused the crisis. They still don't have an explanation for the global financial crisis. So what that meant was, when the crisis hit, they thought, what we should do is increase bank loans.
Seriously?
Seriously. And I'm talking from having read the minutes of the Federal Reserve.
So loans is what's, people borrowing is what's, and being in debt is businesses being in debt, and obviously people as well, is causing it. And their suggestion is to loan more money.
To loan more money.
Okay.
And they also don't understand how the monetary system works.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got some good friends who are neoclassical economists, okay? I often am not as rude as I should be, but seeing the disasters they've set up.
Yeah.
Can I use French in your?
Yeah.
Okay, being polite. I'm now saying it's how disastrous their ideas are. So after the global financial crisis, they didn't even look at the level of private debt. Okay, according to their theories, government debt's the only thing that can cause crises. They completely, even though their statisticians collect it and the Federal Reserve collects the data on private debt, they do not look at it in their models. They didn't go and say, oh, is private debt too high? Or did credit go negative? Because according to their models, this is quoting Ben Bernanke from a paper he wrote in the 1990s, published in his book called Essays on the Great Depression. He said Irving Fisher had an explanation for the Great Depression involving exactly what I'm talking about, too high level of private debt, credit turning negative. And he said Fisher convinced Roosevelt to do the New Deal, so that he's had a political effect. He said his arguments didn't have impact on economics theory, however, because of the counter-argument that private debt credit involves a redistribution of spending power between different groups. Absent implausibly large differences in marginal propensities to spend, pure redistributions should have no significant macroeconomic effect.
Okay.
Now, you look at the data, that is, again, if I could use French, bullshit, because you take a look at it, the negative credit and gives you rising unemployment. The correlation is off the scale. Yeah. They don't even look at it because they start off with a model in which banks can't create money. Okay? Therefore, lending is like I lend you, $50 to go and get dinner tonight. You've got to repay me later. I can spend less, you can spend more. And then you repay me, I can spend more, you can spend less. It cancels out. So for that reason, which is an a priori idea they have, they don't even look at credit. So when it came to the financial crisis, they didn't look at it for a cause, but they thought, if there's more borrowed money in the economy, it'll stimulate demand somehow. They weren't really quite sure how, but they thought we had to restore. They call it restoring the lending channel. They thought it was a breakdown in confidence that caused a disturbance in the financial system. They didn't look at the macro level at all. So the idea was what they did, quantitative easing. First of all, they thought with quantitative easing, they bought bonds off the private banks and off non-bank financial institutions, and they're doing it. The monetary value of bonds that banks hold go down. The reserves they have go up, and they thought they'd lend out the reserves. Okay. That's also impossible. Okay, banks can't lend out reserves. The only way they can lend reserves is if all loans are in cash. Okay, when's the last time you got a cash loan from a bank? I
don't know.
Well, if you go you go to your auto teller, you swipe your credit card. Okay, that's when you get a cash loan from the bank. But that's trivial. Most loans, the bank credits your deposit account, or they credit the deposit account of the shop you're buying from, or the house seller you're buying a house from, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't. You can only have their model of money creation working if all loans are in cash. And the last time that would have been prevalent would have been sometime in the 19th century. Okay. So it's just crazy. They have just false models, and that they're running the economy, and they're running it into the ground. But when it comes back to why there wouldn't be a crisis again, this is all stuff they would never even look at. I said, well, the high level of private debt, which they've encouraged, they haven't let it fall as much as it would have, as it did after the Great Depression. You've got too high level of private debt still. Banks are going to be less willing to lend to people because of the experience they've already been through. People themselves with high levels of debt are less willing to borrow, so you're not going to get much credit-based demand. So rather than having a boom and a slump, you're going to have stagnation. Yeah, that's what I wrote for the 2017 book. Okay. But now, I'm still the same basic argument applies. Private debt sort of hit a peak in America of 170% of GDP. It's about 160% now. Japan was 225%. It's now about 170%. So you're not getting much change in private debt. Okay. But the thing is, at the same time, people are in a large amount of debt still. Because you go back to the 50s, private debt in America was about 50% of GDP. So we're carrying 3 and 4 times as much debt. And the interest rates are similar. Interest rates back in the 50s are pretty much the same as now. So the financial burden on people is higher now than it was then. Because it's high, what you do is you hoard money. You try not to spend. Because you hoard money, you don't create money. Yeah. Okay. You slow down its circulation. You have a lower rate of economic growth coming out of it. So that's what I call credit stagnation.
Okay. So when you mention credit, right, in this term, what does that kind of mean when we talk about credit? We've talked about the meaning of private debt, but what does the meaning of credit mean in this?
Well, it's basically the annual change in debt.
Okay.
So if you have let's say you've got just to make it a personal, individual example, let's say you owe £100,000.
Yeah.
Okay, that's your level of debt. You take out a £50,000 additional mortgage. That's credit. That's your change in debt.
Okay.
So debt is the actual amount you owe. Credit is the change in that amount you owe over a period of time.
Okay.
And when you look at the American economy is the clearest example. So credit, the annual change in debt was positive every year until 2007 from 1945.
Right. Okay.
So you'd have it, we would go up and down in magnitude, but it never went negative until 2007.
Okay.
And then you went from adding 15% to turnover of existing money-based demand to being minus 5%, reducing turnover of total demand, and that's what drove unemployment up. That's what caused the crisis. So credit is fundamental to my way of thinking about how the economy operates. Okay. And like the conventional argument is that it's just a transfer of spending power. No, it's a creation of spending power.
Yeah.
And when people pay debt down, it's a destruction of spending power.
Interesting. So if in what you're talking about, credit going up, that change, if we use that example where we said credit is the change in you potentially borrowing more, right? If when you borrow more, right, is that credit going up?
Yeah,
that's credit going up.
Yeah.
But if you pay it off, that's credit going down. What for the economy generally in terms of this financial crisis, is it good if it goes up or down? I guess. It's probably a credit.
Credit plays an important role in enabling investment. If you didn't have debt financed money being created for investment purposes, you'd have less investment. A huge part of the industrialization of capitalism was debt financed.
Okay.
All the people, sometimes these corporations issuing bonds, often it was bank finance as well. So that plays a critical role in boosting demand, but then you've got the cyclical consequences I spoke about earlier. Yeah. But you want credit to be directed towards productive investment.
Right. Okay.
You want it to go to entrepreneurs. You want it to go to working capital for corporations. And when you look back in the 50s and 60s, that's what it did.
Okay.
But when we deregulated the banks, over time we forgot the Great Depression. Okay? We forgot how bad that crisis was, and consequently, and banking is a great way to make money. I mean, you literally are making money. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, but you're also siphoning off a fair bit of it for yourself, and what you're coming out is bubbles. Yeah. So my favorite example involves Texas. One of my best friends was a banker in Texas, running the commercial division of a major Texan bank, and all the banks were lending into the oil industry. This is in 1980 because you had a fourfold increase in prices in 1973 because of OPEC, and then you had it again in 79. And that meant that it's suddenly incredibly profitable to invest in wells. Everybody financed wells. You was regarded as stupid if you didn't finance wells. There were too many wells. Price collapsed, and I find it's hard saying his name because people can't take it seriously. His name is Richard Vague.
Okay.
V-A-G-U-E. Okay. He is the least vague person I have ever known. Remember there's an old Johnny Cash song called "A Boy Named Sue"?
No.
You haven't heard A Boy Named Sue? No. Have a listen. But anyway, Richard is a bit like that. His name is vague. He's incredibly precise. Yeah. Okay? And so he managed to take over the commercial wing of that bank and then made it profitable, not the commercial wing, the domestic wing, domestic lending. Took that over, made it profitable, started another one, very profitable there. And he said, as a banker in Texas in the 80s, if you weren't into oil, you were regarded as a fool. So you had they're like a whole bunch of lemmings jumping off a cliff. Yeah. The whole thing plunges. Okay. So that's you don't want to deregulate finance. Yeah. You want to say, if you want to run a bank, we're giving you a license to create money. You better use that license well. Yeah. And then you can so we'd support you if you want to finance productive working capital for corporations, finance if you want to give money to entrepreneurs, which is dangerous for banks because they can lose, a lot of entrepreneurs fail.
Yeah.
But you should be providing working capital for firms and money for consumers to buy large items they can't buy out of their savings. Instead, when we let them just do whatever they want to do and they caught up in financial speculation, they invent collateralized debt obligations and all this nonsense that they did during the financial crisis. You got a boom and then a bust.
Yeah.
And that's disastrous
Yeah.
for capitalism. So I'd far rather have controls on what banks can lend for, not tell them who to lend to, but tell them you can't lend for asset speculation. But instead what they do these days, that's almost all they do. They finance into speculation on house prices and speculation on share prices.
Yeah. Amazing. So you're saying you don't think we will have another global financial crisis?
Not because of the financial sector.
Okay, cool. What do you think?
Climate.
Okay, yeah, which we've talked about a lot. So you do think another global financial crisis will happen? It's inevitable.
It's inevitable.
That is such an ominous statement. Okay, so why is this? Okay, let's talk about that. Why do you think that the climate change will cause a global financial crisis?
Again, economists are responsible. Okay, economists they reacted to the challenge from a group called the Limits to Growth. Okay, which argued that capitalism would face society would face an environmental crisis sometime in the 21st century. They reacted to that by driving that particular analysis out of economics, and they then made up their own numbers about climate change. So they simply assumed that climate change would only affect businesses which were outdoors. Okay. Okay.
Businesses outdoor.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the paper I'm thinking of is a paper in 1991 by William Nordhaus.
Okay.
And in that paper, he said that he divided American industry into three sectors: significantly exposed to climate change, moderately exposed, and I can never say the word negligible. Negligibly exposed to climate change.
Yeah.
He put 87% of the American economy in the negligibly exposed bracket.
Okay.
Now, the only thing the industries had in common was they happened undercover. Okay. So he's basically saying, equating climate to weather and saying if you're exposed to the weather, you're exposed to climate. If you're not exposed to the weather, you're not exposed to climate, and therefore you produce trivial estimates of damages. So his first paper, which put a number on what we could expect from climate change in terms of damages to the economy, was he got 1/4% to fall in GDP when temperature was hit 3 degrees warming. Yeah, and he said he made a couple of ad hoc guesses, and he's used the word hunch. My hunch is the damages from 3 degrees of warming will be no more than 2%, 2% of GDP.
Okay,
now
2%
that means
damage to GDP.
Damage, yeah,
globally.
that's damage to future GDP, and it's assuming GDP is going to continue growing.
Yeah.
Okay, so he was in his latest paper, published in 2024. He said that his new revised model says that a 3-degree increase in global temperatures over pre-industrial by 2100 will make GDP in 2100 3.12% lower than it would have been with no climate change at all. Now, that means, like, let's say it's, it's 100, just give it a number 100. So rather than being 100, it's going to be 96.8, 96.9. Okay. So that's, to have that gap 80 years from now, the rate of growth to get that gap to occur is trivial. It converts into I think it was a 0.05% fall in the annual rate of economic growth. Okay. Now the trouble, and they've done a whole range of other methods after that, all of which are garbage. And the thing is, financial people working in the finance markets think when they see a paper being refereed, they think it's quality control. Yeah. Well, no, it can be confirming a belief system. So economists didn't believe climate change was going to matter, and they've made up numbers to reach that conclusion. So the finance sector has valued all these assets on the expectation that climate change is going to have a trivial impact upon the economy. It isn't.
Yeah.
And when reality starts to strike and holy shit, this is bigger than we thought, asset prices are going to plunge in one of many, many ways. Insurance companies could refuse to insure companies. Certainly they'll refuse to insure houses. Physical assets could get wiped out on a grand scale. Seriously.
Okay.
And also the damage to capacity to produce output will be so much greater than people think that that'll then factor into asset valuations. So at some point they're going to plunge.
Yeah. Do you, how do I ask this? Do you have a potential time frame of when you think this climate change issue is going to impact? Actually, no. Let me ask another question first. If it's not going to be a 2-3% impact on GDP, how much of an impact do you think on a range, on a
100%.
scale? 100%. 100% impact on GDP?
On the trajectory we're on,
okay.
Yes. If we don't stop, and we've shown no signs of stopping, at some point we'll wipe out our capacity to produce.
We will wipe out our capacity to make money.
To produce goods and services.
To produce
Forget
goods
about making money.
Hold on, sorry. I'm laughing here, but this doesn't.
I know.
I'm laughing, but this doesn't sound funny. Okay, so let me just compose myself. So we will wipe out our ability to produce goods and services. Why would that be the case?
This is where you've got to understand climate science.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'll give you the most, and climate scientists themselves have been learning about the climate as this goes on, because climate science as an independent discipline only really began in the 1960s. We had meteorology before that, because meteorology was about, how do you predict a stable climate?
Yeah.
Then you start to say, well, maybe what's the climate changing? How the hell do we handle that? Okay, so you've got to build models where you feed in high levels of carbon dioxide causing changes in in temperature and circulation patterns, rainfall, and so on. So it's only in the 1960s that this stuff really started to develop.
Okay.
And we've also, we're monitoring various systems we didn't have monitoring technology for some time ago. So the scariest of the lot is called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. Now, people... You know what the Gulf Stream is? Well, the Gulf Stream is a surface phenomenon. It's caused by the rotation of the planet. It causes prevailing winds, and that the winds will always, so long as the planet continues rotating, there'll be a Gulf Stream. Okay, but the AMOC is part of what's called the thermohaline circulation, and that's ocean current. Huge sets of ocean currents, which move. I think I'm not an expert, so I'm going off papers I've read, and I could be wrong in some of the numbers I give. But it's either between 15 and 30 times the volume of the flow of all the rivers on the planet. That's the scale of it, and it doesn't just transfer water. It's moving much more slowly than rivers do, but it's transporting heat as well. So it goes from the Antarctic to the Arctic, it goes from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean, et cetera, and the part which is roughly the same location as the Gulf Stream is taking warm water from the Atlantic equatorial region, and it then brushes up past Europe, and then as it gets saltier by evaporation, it gets heavier, and it then falls down into the depths, and it loses its heat as it's doing that as well. So a major reason why we've got the climate we have in Europe is because of heat being transferred by the AMOC from the particularly the equatorial regions of the Atlantic Ocean up to Europe. If you take that away, Europe falls in temperature by between 6 to 8 degrees. Maybe I could be slightly wrong with some of the figures, and the UK between 8 and 14 degrees.
Like that's the drop in temperature.
That's the drop in temperature.
8 to 14. So right now, if we let's say today, I think it's like 11. You're telling me it'll be like -3.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay.
Now, when the first work was done on this, and this goes back to a paper in 2008 by Tim Lenton, who's the climate scientist professor at Exeter University. So Tim pulled together all the experts on at this stage, experts on different tipping points, and said there's a possibility of tipping cascades. So the fact that the Greenland is melting, for example, that's what is undermining the AMOC, because this as the water evaporates on the, you've got warm water on the surface, evaporates, loses moisture to the air. That means it gets saltier. But the saltier, when you get further and further north, saltier and saltier, it then sinks because it's heavier. But if you pour in Greenland, melt ice, ice melting and becoming, that's fresh water. Yeah, you actually reduce the salt level and it doesn't sink. Okay, so ultimately, that what they call the conveyor belt, that northern part between the equator to Europe and then back down to the equator again, which would be sort of a big loop that goes. It goes on, just sort of a bit of a torus in shape, but it goes from the Caribbean around to Europe and then dives back down again. And the cold water then goes back down to the equator and gets warmed up again, and that becomes part of another circulation system. Yeah. We're finding signs that's reducing already, quite strongly reducing in strength. And the original estimates were it would take between 3 and 5 degrees of warming. This is the 2008 paper, and that might take 2 or 3 centuries. Okay? Yeah. Okay. Now the latest estimates are 1.1 to 2.8 degrees of warming. We're already at 1.4. There are arguments we're really at 1.6. So we're in that range, and people doing mathematical models of the whole dynamics of the AMOC and the thermohaline circulation are now estimating there's a range of estimates coming out, but the most pessimistic said 95% chance of it failing between 2025 and 2075, and a more recent paper's come out giving, I think, it's still yet to be published. It's a working paper. I think it was a 67% chance between now and 2040.
Now in 2040 of this issue happening.
This happening.
Okay.
Now, when that happens, effectively Europe becomes uninhabitable.
Oh my God, sorry. What? Okay, so if the temperature dropping that much, it becomes uninhabitable. But why is it uninhabitable?
Well, for a start, one of the factors, like the main greenhouse gas is actually water vapor.
Yeah.
Okay? Carbon dioxide provides about 1/3 of the warming. Water vapor provides about 2/3. Now, the water vapor depends upon temperature. If you drop the temperature, the water vapor falls. You increase it, the water vapor rises. It's about a 7%. For 1 degree of warming, it's about 7% difference in the water level. So that means that's why we know the incredible floods you're seeing and flash floods all around the world right now. Okay. There's about 10% more moisture in the global atmosphere than there was in pre-industrial stages. Yeah. So it's coming down in catastrophic storms right now. But if you go the other way in the north, and this is just literally it would only be the Europe and parts of North America that get affected, northern parts of Canada. But if it goes, then you get up to a 6 to 8 degree fall in the temperature, and that means a sort of 40% fall in the moisture levels. So as well as getting colder, it's also drier. If you've ever been to a very cold region, you know how dry it is. Okay, it's because cold air holds less moisture. Yeah. So you would have, again, up to a 40% fall in rainfall across Europe, which, as well as being colder, it's also drier. Yeah. Your agriculture breaks down. Okay, people can't survive there anymore. So that is a possibility before 2050.
Okay, I understand.
And more likely 2040.
2040. So because of the weather change, potentially this drastic weather change, right? Agriculture gets affected. Obviously, that means that they can't produce food. But then, couldn't people say, can't they just import it?
Sorry?
Can't they just import the food?
Well,
import stuff. The
AMOC is a heat distribution system.
Okay.
If there's colder in Europe, it's warmer everywhere else.
Okay.
And the heat disrupts the other systems in the rest of the planet.
Right. Okay.
We don't realize, this is one thing I'm putting together with some climate scientists. We don't realize when we actually evolved an industrial civilization in terms of, we know as we think about Mesopotamia, and we now know of what the Turkish place, the oldest monolithic structure we know is 12,500 years old in Turkey. And that's the period of human industrial and urban agricultural civilization. That, when you look in the long-term history of the temperature of the planet, was on the peak of what's called a Milankovitch cycle.
Okay.
Ever heard of that?
No.
Okay. Milankovitch cycle is an extremely complicated cycle in the temperature of the planet caused by variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun. So yeah, first of all, the Earth's orbit goes from being elliptical to circular and back again. Okay. It goes the Earth's on an angle. That's why we have summer and winter. Okay. And so the tilt will change.
Yeah.
And then the tilt rotates. There are three motions altogether. Now, when you put that together, you get this natural cycle that causes dramatic changes in temperature, but it causes it because the temperature variations cause changes in effectively carbon dioxide records those changes. So it gets hotter, more carbon dioxide production, that increases more. The water vapor goes up as well.
Yeah.
Okay, complex cycle like that. So when you look at it, the previous ice age was about 60,000 years long, and the peaks of the Milankovitch cycle sort of 10,000 years up and 10,000 years down, roughly speaking. So you think like a sawtooth. So 10,000 years up, a little peak at the top because you go for the rotation, then you come down again, and there's a flat area and up and down. Well, we evolved on one of those peaks. As it happens, that peak is one where the orbit of the planet is extremely circular. So it would have been a longer peak. It would have lasted 40,000 years rather than 10,000 years. But that's where we had enough moisture in the air. Okay, so you go back to the ice age, it was drier because it was colder. So the estimates are between 4 and 6 degrees colder than now. That means between 30% and 40% less moisture. You come up to the Holocene period, you've got it's like Goldilocks. It's just right. So you get enough moisture, and agriculture can happen in what used to be tundra, frozen wastes.
Yeah.
And so we built sedentary agriculture, and the stability occurred because of the turning point.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, we're pushing off that like a bloody rocket. Okay, we don't realize stability of the climate was essential for the evolution of human civilization. We're destroying it without even understanding it.
Okay.
And then when that destruction hits, that you'll get places we currently do agriculture will no longer be viable for agriculture. And again, work by Tim Lenton with the OECD in 2021, using mathematical models, of course, of the climate, said that if you combine a 2.5 degree warming with the failure of the AMOC, the area of the planet which is suitable for growing wheat drops by 70%.
Okay.
Now, if you have Europe, losing it, people aren't going to export to Europe.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Okay, so let's talk about it. So impacted areas. So you think Europe, America, that will be the most impacted? Is there specific places in Europe and America?
Oh, England in particular. I mean, England's fallen to 8 to 14 degrees fall. Forget about everything alcohol. UK already imports about 40% of its food. Yeah. If it can't produce the 60% it currently produces, we'll have
to import more, then it's a struggle.
Becomes uninhabitable.
Yeah.
Okay. See, the stability of the climate enabled us to have agricultural systems.
Yeah.
And the agriculture itself depends massively upon oil.
Yeah.
You and I, they talk about the Green Revolution. It was actually the Brown Revolution because you used fossil fuels to produce superphosphate that enable you to have the level of food output we currently have.
Yeah.
So that's all gets destroyed by climate change changing the location which rainfall occurs, less rainfall in areas like Europe, much less. So that means droughts and you can't grow food anymore. But where you can grow, you suddenly have catastrophic floods. Right. You can't grow for that reason either. Okay. So the capacity to produce food for the populations we have disappears. Okay. And then in that situation, civilization starts breaking down.
Okay. So, agriculture being affected means that we then have a food crisis, and then that food crisis then obviously impacts us because we need to survive on food, right, as well. And then that in turn then obviously with the agriculture crisis happening, obviously we're not producing any income or revenue because we can't produce agriculture to sell it. But then it also means that because of the food crisis, and if people are struggling with that, then are you saying that they're not going to be working and things like that? That's that'll have an impact on that.
Oh
that
yeah,
side,
I mean,
the
also like
productivity and all that
it
sort of
isn't.
stuff.
I mean, it isn't true that being under a roof will save you from climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to get destruction of physical infrastructure between factories.
Yeah.
You can't ship goods anymore.
Yeah.
We rely upon fossil fuels for not just energy. Like we sort of think fossil fuels and light and running mobile phones and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But they're essential for so many industrial processes like making cement. If we realise that we've got, we face existential crisis. This isn't about optimums, levels of output, cost-benefit analysis. This is existential. In that situation, we're likely to do the wrong thing, first of all. We're likely to use more, like countries which get hit by impossible temperature rises. They will be probably using more air conditioning and more coal-fired stations. I just see chaos in our future, I'm afraid.
Okay.
And I wish I was alone.
Yeah.
The people who see it most, there's a variation in attitudes amongst climate scientists. Some are optimistic about potential to change it around, but most of the people I'm channeling in this are professionals, researchers in climate change, and they're terrified.
Wow.
And they can't get the message through.
Yeah.
So they're thinking, we tried to warn you, it's going to happen, probably. And only after people realize how serious the damage is, they say, why didn't you warn us? We said we did. So that's, in that situation, the finance sector is going to be an afterthought.
Wow. Okay, so Europe will be affected, America will be affected. Is there anywhere else in the world?
The rest of the world. I mean,
the rest of the world.
The AMOC, the thermohaline circulation is like the air conditioning system for the planet. Okay. Because you've got cold water in the Arctic, obviously. The current goes up to towards the equator, cools the equator, but also the water gets warmed.
Yeah.
Okay. And then it goes further up the Pacific and comes down and goes through. So you've got this huge heat distribution system.
Yeah.
Now, if you don't have the heat distribution system, places that get hot get hotter, places that cold get colder.
Yeah.
So you get a more extreme distribution of temperature across the planet, and that itself will disrupt.
Okay.
So this is a worry which climate scientists themselves thought was 2 or 3 centuries away. The more they research about it, the more the answers come back from the models and the data saying it's in our immediate future.
Yeah. Sorry if I missed this, right? What are we doing that is causing this to happen?
Carbon dioxide.
Pumping it
out into the planet.
So is that using the fossil fuels?
Fossil fuels.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, carbon.
Interesting.
It's been known for 1.5 centuries, coming on to 2 centuries, that carbon dioxide captures heat.
Yeah.
Okay. I've forgotten. There's a female. Aarhus is a name that rings a bell, but there's a female scientist before him who tested by just shining light through, I think it's shining heat actually, heating up a cylinder containing different gases.
Yeah.
Oxygen, no change. Nitrogen, no change. Carbon dioxide, it got hotter. So there's some way in which infrared energy was captured by carbon dioxide. It's been known for 2 centuries. Only recently have people worked out the mathematics of why it does that.
Yeah.
It involves quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
It's quite complicated. It involves a particular frequency range as well. But fundamentally, one way to think about it is that carbon dioxide is literally carbon atom in the middle, which has 4 potential chemical bonds with 2 oxygen atoms either side, which have 2 potential bonds. Yeah. And they get hit by an infrared proton and they vibrate. Okay. It's sort of friction. It's more complicated than that. But the fact that it's got that shape is why it absorbs the energy, whereas oxygen alone, like O2, 2 oxygen atoms, doesn't change. Yeah. The photon goes straight through. Okay. So it's the fact that what happens is the light's you've got infrared energy leaving the surface of the planet. Yeah. If it doesn't hit a carbon dioxide molecule, it goes straight through. If it does hit a carbon dioxide molecule, when it gets retransmitted, or another photon gets retransmitted, also infrared, it can go only 360 degrees. Yeah. So it slows down how fast the energy gets out of the planet, and that's why the planet's warming.
Okay, that makes sense. So fossil fuels are the issues. So you're saying, you said GDP could basically go to 0, right?
Yep.
So then I'm thinking, if GDP goes to 0, what's the actual global impact of this then? What are we potentially looking
Industrial
at?
civilization collapses.
What does that mean? I know what that means, but I'm asking you to clear. What does that mean? Do you mean people are gone? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Oh my God.
It's an existential crisis. This is actually,
okay.
there's one of my favorite
gosh.
papers by Zhu and Ramanathan from 2017. They went through talking about temperature levels and what the impact is on society, very, very vaguely. Only economists have said temperature and GDP. Because we think in GDP terms all the time, they're the ones politicians have listened to.
Yeah.
And they've said trivial impacts. Scientists, on the other hand, have been saying what happens to circulation systems, local temperatures, life forms. And Zhu and Ramanathan said 1.5 degrees is dangerous, 3 degrees is catastrophic, and 5 degrees is beyond catastrophic, including existential risks.
Okay.
Now, we didn't think we'd hit 1.5 until 2040. We're certainly going to hit 1.5, however you measure it, this decade. Okay, we're already like in terms of the most immediate data. If you're not, a lot of the data numbers they give are based on long-term trends or are moving a sliding window. But at the moment, we're about 1.5 to 1.6 degrees warmer than pre-industrial, and that was something that the original model said, given the carbon dioxide effect of retaining heat, we wouldn't hit 1.5 until about 2040. We're now already at 1.5.
Yeah.
So it's faster than people thought. And then what you get is a whole range of tipping point effects coming out. So frozen land in the northern Siberia and so on is melting. Because it melts, the vegetable mass there becomes exposed, and it either gets consumed by anaerobic bacteria, in which case it becomes methane, or consumed by aerobic, so it becomes carbon dioxide, and that is already happening on a grand scale. So that then means we've set off processes we can't control that are going to amplify what we began. And then when that starts happening, it's beyond our capacity to control it.
Okay.
We should never have seen it as a cost-benefit exercise.
Yeah. Okay, so this is not something that should have been modeled in that way. Okay, is there any way for us to prevent this, slow it down, anything? Is there anything we can do?
We are so dependent upon fossil fuels.
Yeah.
If we'd taken the argument of limits to growth seriously in 1972, so 50-something years ago, we could have started doing this gradually. They were trashed by the economists. They sold lots of copies of the book, but nobody took their analysis in policy, took their analysis seriously. Economists told them soothing words about, minor damages and don't worry about it sort of stuff. So it's too late for the market. Forget about carbon pricing. You're not going to nudge the market to overcome this problem. We could have nudged it 50 years ago. Too late now. So you'd have to, if you had a drop in our fossil fuel consumption right now, that alone would cause an 85% fall in GDP.
What?
Because again, it's crazy how primitive economics is. Economists' models of production don't include energy.
Okay, so it doesn't include
a bit like they don't include credit. Money.
Okay.
That's why they didn't see the financial.
Okay, so their model is not taking into account this rise in degrees and stuff. They're not modeling that. They're
not even including the cause of it in their models of production.
That's crazy.
They didn't include credit in their macroeconomic models, so they couldn't see the financial crisis coming. They don't include energy in their models of production, so they can't see any problems coming out of energy. Now, of course, when 85% of energy comes from fossil fuels, and fossil fuels is causing global warming, if you had to cut fossil fuel consumption to zero, you'd also cut GDP by 85%. And again, they're not aware of that.
Wow. So it sounds like regardless, something bad is going to happen, even if we were to stop. Like you said, 85% GDP collapse is crazy. So definitely a global financial crisis sounds like is on the way, which isn't great. Is there anything people could do about it?
We're stuck at the period where the only thing we can do is try to reverse engineer our way out of trouble. And that's going to happen. I think that's inevitable as well. Because some countries, like particularly India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, they're the ones who are most likely to suffer catastrophic heat effects or losing their monsoons and being unable to produce the food the huge part of their food production relies upon the monsoon cycle. If that becomes totally unstable, then you start getting tens of millions of Indians dying of famine, or you have, like was argued in the book, not a very good book in my opinion, but a book called Ministry for the Future, envisaged what's called a wet bulb catastrophe in India, spiking change. If that happens, I can see us doing rogue geoengineering. So one of the cheapest ways to reduce the global temperature is to put sulfur dioxide into the air, and that'll be tried. The one that I really like is called MIR, and that stands for Mirrors for Earth Energy Rebalancing. And we could put mirrors to reflect the light off the planet before it gets turned into infrared energy. So there are various things we can attempt to do, but they themselves are going to cause chaotic outcomes. If you try to manipulate if you got a temperature which is like a planet which is already going crazy in terms of the stability of where used to is gone, and you have famines and floods and drought and the crazy effects around the planet, that's already going to disrupt production. But if you then try to counter it by things like reflecting energy into outer space, or absorbing tons of it through growing lots of bamboo, or seeding the ocean so you get effects in the ocean which trap carbon dioxide, all that sort of, they're going to cause crazy effects as well. So, maybe we could reduce the average level of the temperature, but the distribution is going to be crazy at the same time. So there's no easy way out of this.
Okay.
It's a predicament. It's not a problem.
Bad
it's a
predicament. Talking about predicaments, right? I want to move on to talking about the UK. I know we're talking about global level, and the UK, right? We've got a new government happening, and I know you wrote a few papers on, or blog post, should I say, on Britain Can't Afford Rachel Reeves, right?
Yeah.
At a high level, and bear in mind, people, watchers, listeners, we're recording this before the budget. But them coming into government, right? What are your thoughts for, they've come in saying, they're gonna, let me not say supercharge the economy, but they think that they're gonna be doing things. I think they haven't said what taxes they may increase. We don't know yet. You said that they're gonna cut winter fuel payments, is it, to pensioners and stuff like that?
Yeah.
What's your position on
I think it's insanely
them?
bad policy.
Okay.
I mean, going for growth itself is not what I'd be doing right now if I had the reins of power. Okay?
Yeah.
I'd be doing, how do we manage to survive what's coming forward? That'd be my main focus. And how do we make sure people don't starve? I'd be looking at systems to enable distribution of food to still occur, even if there are shortages. But given the fact that they're obsessed with economic growth, Rachel Reeves is basically reading from an economics textbook as to how to do it, and economics textbooks have no fucking idea of how the monetary system works. And so she's learnt these models that tell her that if she cuts back on government spending, that will increase investment. And you can actually find that in textbooks. Okay, the ManQ, which is one of the main textbooks they teach undergraduate macro out of, literally argues that if you cut government spending, you'll boost investment. Now, that's wrong. Okay, the government spending actually creates money that is not associated with debt for the people who receive it, and that increases the supply of money. A government deficit increases the amount of money in the system without debt attached to it for the individuals getting it. And when you look at you do the accounting properly, the government doesn't borrow money from the public. Okay, it creates money by running a deficit, and then when it sells bonds, when it creates the deficit, money by creating a deficit, it also creates excess reserves, and bonds are then sold to banks, and they then find what they call primary dealers and in things like gilt auctions, and the funds that enable that to be purchased are in the reserve accounts of the banks at this Bank of England. That's where the swapping of funds for bonds comes from. There is no borrowing going on. There's money creation instead. That even applies to interest payments. There's money creation by either the Treasury or by the Bank of England. So if you but the textbooks teach as if the banks and the firms and the government all banked at the private banks, and then when the government wants to spend it, if it spends more than it gets back in taxation, it has to borrow off the households, sells the households bonds, has to pay an interest rate. That increases the demand for money. There's only a fixed amount of money in the economy. This is what the textbooks are like. So the government taking money away means there's less money for firms.
Yeah.
The economy slows down. You have a crisis. That's what she thinks is going to happen.
Yeah.
But it's based on a completely false model of how the banking sector works.
Okay.
So implementing it, she's going to freeze, I think the Labor Party research itself said cutting the winter fuel subsidy, this is back when they're in opposition, would kill 4,000 pensioners. So you're going to kill 4,000 pensioners and slow the economy down.
So you think by them trying to address the deficit, and sorry, just to explain to the watchers and listeners, when we're talking about the deficit means that they are spending, the government's spending more money than they're taking in taxation. That's what deficit means, right? So by them trying to spend less than they're taking in, you're saying that this could potentially cause an issue in the economy where I think looking at your reading, you're saying that we actually won't grow. Is that what you're saying? The economy in the UK won't grow. It's counterproductive.
For what she's actually trying to achieve, it's counterproductive.
Okay, cool. So then the answer is to stay at deficit, you think? Or?
I want to rename deficit to fiat.
Fear?
Fiat.
Okay.
Because
fear.
Like if you're and I've been in this personal situation with financial issues over my life.
Yeah.
If you're spending more than you're earning, you've got to borrow money from a bank.
Yeah.
You can't create it yourself, and that's a deficit. Okay, but when the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it actually creates money.
Okay,
and that's the capacity of a government. We call it fiat because it's saying by the direction of the king or by the direction of the government.
Okay,
so we use the same word for a household situation that we do for a government, but a government operates by fiat. So when it spends more than it takes back in taxation, it's putting more money in private bank accounts than it's taking out of private bank accounts. It's actually creating money. Where if you look at the textbooks, and again, Mankiw's a great example here, it argues there's a fixed amount of money in existence. If the government takes some of it, there's less for the private sector, so there's less investment that's possible, and interest rates rise.
Okay.
That's what's in her mind.
Okay.
It's a total myth.
Okay. So if she because that's what you were saying in your blog post, that if she does do this, try to reduce the deficit, that interest rates could increase again, which is bad news because interest rates are already higher than most people, and it's so expensive for most people in terms of like mortgages and things like that. So I guess for people then, what can people do to navigate this if this is going to happen? Is there anything that they could do to navigate this?
Well, we've got to defeat Rachel Reeves and Starmer.
Okay. So what, we lobby against them?
Lobby against them. I mean, this is why I've developed a software package called Ravel, which is the only software package that enables you to model the monetary system using double entry bookkeeping. Yeah. And I'm like, I can persuade people when I show it myself to people, but if you look at the accounting structure of the economy, what Reeves is doing is based on a world that doesn't exist. Okay. So when you model it, I can model it in Ravel, and I've done that in that blog post you mentioned, and it shows, yes, if that's what the world we lived in, where debt was borrowed, firms borrowed from households and government borrowed from households, in which case the debt would be an asset of the household sector. Okay. But in the real world, firms borrow from banks and governments sell bond to banks. Okay, so what you find is the debt of the firms is an asset of the banking sector, and the bonds that are owned by the banks are an asset of the banking sector. Yeah. So the government's not actually borrowing; it's creating money. Okay, you rearrange the system, and you see that that's what gives you growth. Okay, the money grows because banks lend out more than they get back in repayments, and governments spend more than they take back in taxation. If neither of those happen, the money supply doesn't grow, and you don't get physical growth in a system with a falling money supply.
Yeah.
Okay, because money, you got to buy your technology.
Yeah.
Okay, if you have less money around, you're not going to be able to afford the technology. So real economic growth has occurred when there's been monetary growth
Okay.
at the same time. What she's doing, she thinks is going to reallocate money away from the government to the firm sector, and then the economy is going to grow because of that. In fact, what she's doing is reducing the amount of money available. Firms are likely to invest less rather than more.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So then what do you see in terms of the future of the UK economy then in the next 5 years, given this is what she will do? What do you...
I don't think she'll last 5 years. I don't think Starmer will last 5 years. I think at some point there'll be a coup against them.
Okay.
But is this terror of a deficit, which, it's terror of the government doing what a government should do, which is create fiat money. Because we live in a mixed financial system. We have both government money creation and private money creation. We need both of them in various ways. We've had far too much credit creation and not enough fiat money creation, so they're making that problem worse.
Yeah.
And again, it's stupidity of economists, stupid theories to hang onto a paradigm that they prefer. It's just destructive. So what you're going to get is lower growth. Okay, so the growth will be disappointing. Disappointing numbers were announced by the ONS today, yada, yada, yada. You'll get that ad nauseum.
Yeah.
And at some point, you'll look at, the sacrifices you've been through, dead pensioners, alienating the trade union movement completely, NHS problems, all the sort of stuff we're having at the moment will be worse under their administration.
Yeah.
And so at some point, there'll be a couple of years of failure. And I think there'll be an internal, particularly if you start losing by-elections.
Yeah.
And they've got 530 seats in this country. Plenty of people. That the average death rate is enough to make sure you've got 10 or 20 by-elections per year. If you start seeing reform gaining or the Tories coming back, at some point the Labor Party are going to get their balls together and say, we're going to get rid of this pair and get somebody else. So we're going to go through the same chaos with the Labor Party that we've been through with the Tories.
Wow. That's crazy. I actually wanted to ask you a question about fiat money, because there's this impression that people say, inflation was created, part of it was created because there was more money being created. What's your what do you say about that?
I take on the National Rifle Association in America.
Yeah.
And they have a slogan saying guns don't kill people, people kill people.
Yeah.
Well, my argument is money doesn't create inflation, people create inflation, but money can enable it. So there are three main factors that can give you inflation. You can have a decline in your productivity, which means you have a higher per unit cost. We had that with COVID on steroids because of disruptions to the supply chain. Firms can increase the price, the markup they make on their cost of production, and workers can demand money wage rises.
Yeah.
Now, what you see during COVID is there was initially, when the government pumped in a huge amount of money to stop the system collapsing, which we had to do, then money wages increased for a while. There was a wage boost. Then after that, markups increased. And one reason that could happen is that with the additional monetary demand from government money creation during COVID, firms saw less rivalry because you couldn't sell an overseas trip. You couldn't get on a plane, but there were lots of money for other things. People were buying goods and services galore. So in that situation, the amount of competition that firms perceived declined. So we can put our markups up. Okay? So the money creation enables that to happen, but it doesn't directly cause it.
Okay.
And there's not just one form of money creation. Again, these theories that blame money for causing inflation just think about government money creation, and they've got an inadequate model of that to begin with.
Yeah.
In the real world, we have, as I said, banks create money by lending out more than they get back in repayments, and they mainly finance asset bubbles out of that, unfortunately. Governments create money by spending more than they get back in taxation. There are those two causes of monetary growth, not just one.
Okay.
So it's a much more complex picture than that simple Austrian line about.
That's what people say, and then that's what when people then talk about crypto. Crypto is deflationary, so that's why the value's going up and blah 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 blah. And people talk about it and stuff like that. given what you're saying about Rachel Reeves and trying to cut the deficit, do you then think that, I know that you said that interest rates could rise as part of your model. What about
No, in fact, interest rates, well,
interest rates and then I think flatlines. I can't remember.
Well, what I had in the model, I had interest rates rising because of the theory.
Yeah.
But the theory basically says interest rates are driven by demand versus supply for money.
Okay.
In the real world, interest rates are set by the central bank for bonds, and then you get the market has some determination of the margin you'll put on top of that.
Okay.
In fact, private banks benefit from higher interest rates on bonds because it's a high revenue stream for them. They suffer because that drives down the value of the old bonds they've got. So there's fragility in the system as well. But I don't expect a large amount of movement in interest rates out of this.
Cool.
Yeah.
What about inflation? Do you see inflation changing?
Well, inflation is likely to be much the level it is at the moment, 2 to 3%. But the trouble is, if you have a collapse in food production, then you're going to have an increase in food prices. And if that's where you start saying, look, you can't rely upon the market anymore, because if you get food becoming too expensive for people to buy, you're going to have riots. And what you have to do is ration.
Yeah. Gosh. Okay. So I wanted to definitely ask you this question about personal finance investing. When we spoke, you told me you're not a fan of personal finance. Can you talk to me about that?
Personal finance?
Or maybe it was investing.
No, I think the whole thing's a waste of time because like it's all been generated. The whole growth of the private pension industry was driven by governments trying to get pensions off their books. Okay. The whole used to have significant state pensions, and that caused a large deficit, which I would call a large fiat government money creation. And because of this, again, the conventional economists being obsessed about not running a deficit because their models say it's going to cause a crisis. What you had was governments encouraging the private provision of pensions rather than public provision of pensions. Now, and that's all based on your income. So it means wealthy people have a large pension, or poor people get shit, and it's incredibly ineffective, and also it doesn't provide to people across the board. We should be having a system where once you can no longer work, you're supported. Okay, you people should not starve to death because they can't work anymore. That's called slavery. Okay, you don't want to live in a slave society. And that means you provide for people once they're no longer able to work. You keep them alive with, you contribute to their capacity to buy goods and services and remain alive after they can no longer work. If you say that it depends upon your income scale level, then the poor are going to starve to death and the rich are going to do very nicely, thanks very much. That's slave society stuff. That's not a civilized society at all. So, and also, like most of the money that was people were supposed to individually save and put towards their pensions, in private pensions and so on, that's all gone into stock market speculation. It's driven up stock prices. You've got ridiculous stock prices. The price-to-earnings ratio is becoming ridiculous. That's all been encouraged by moving away from state pensions. So we should have simply had state pensions all the way through. It's a mistake to enable that to happen. And there's enormous numbers of fees. There's some people in the finance sector who are very wealthy courtesy of this. They've made large amounts of money out of it, and they're going to persuade chancellors that it's a great idea and you should give us more money for this and more money for that. Let's privatise water, for example. That's going to work really well. I'm sure you're going to you're going to get great shit out of private water. All these things have been caused by bad economic theory. Swallowing bad economic theory, then applying it, and the consequences are far different to what people were told. Because again, the whole what's called neoliberal period, the argument in favour of neoliberalism was you're going to grow faster. You look at the economic data. UK's growth rate has not changed substantially between the bad Keynesian days and the good neoliberal days, and America's rate of growth is halved. Okay. Under the bad Keynesian days, they grew twice as fast as they're growing under the good neoliberal days. It's been a farce. And we've just fallen for this farce because we have a theory of economics which is persuasive but wrong.
So, you know what you said about pensions fueling the stock market. Okay, I understand that.
Yeah.
But from a personal point of view, because I love to advocate for obviously budgeting, investing in the stock market, investing in property, and it's more from a point of view for you to look after yourself. And I do get what you're saying about the state pension being able to cover people when they no longer work. So are you saying you're not a fan of people doing that?
It's speculation. It's not investing.
Okay.
Like, speculation is gambling over the price of an asset. Okay. Investing is building an asset.
Okay. That's an interesting definition. Okay.
So investment is the sort of thing that entrepreneurs do, and they need finance for it. Companies do it. They need the staff to get that done. They need finance to hire the staff, finance to buy the goods and services, and so on. So there's a big difference between speculation and investment. And we've ended up in an incredibly speculative economy that doesn't invest. So we have all this massive gambling over share prices and house prices, and nobody's building any companies, nobody's building any homes.
Yeah.
Not quite nobody, but the increased financialization of society hasn't meant society is more productive. It's meant it's more based on gambling.
Okay. So then, what can we do to make money? What can people do to make money?
Well, they can if they can come up with a new product.
Okay. So people should be entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Well, there's only a handful of people who end up being entrepreneurs. So you've got to have a brilliant idea. Okay. And be able to sell it to other people as well. I've done number 1. I haven't done number 2 yet. So I know the situation of being an entrepreneur. But that's what we should be encouraging, and that means the finance sector should be serving entrepreneurs and industrialists. The finance sector should be the servant of the industrial side of the economy, not the master. We've ended up letting it be the master, and that ends up with catastrophe because all you do is gamble and speculate, and they slice off fees off the top. You see The Wolf of Wall Street. That's a fairly honest statement of the type of world we get when we let the finance sector run the show rather than letting the industrial sector run the show.
Okay. You know what? I like what you said about being the servant of entrepreneurs and then financing entrepreneurs to create products. I like that because as an entrepreneur, I understand that and I'm all for that and I'm all for creating products. But then I do also get the other side of maybe you're not an entrepreneur, but then you want to invest in companies doing great things and you want to take a share of that as well, right? So I understand that part.
But then when you buy shares, you're not giving money to the company you're buying the shares
You're buying
of.
it from somebody else. That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
The secondary market dominates finance.
Yeah,
it's all gambling
true.
And speculation.
That's true. You are exchange it between somebody else and then at a higher price, similar to like property, right? You're buying property from another person. You're not buying it directly.
You're not building a house.
Yeah, exactly. I did have a question though about state pension. This would be like my final question.
Yeah.
Is it sustainable though? Because obviously it sounds like you're advocate for it, but is it affordable for the government to continue state pensions in the future?
Yes.
Faithful. You think so?
So long as you have the productive facilities.
Okay.
And that's what you don't have in the UK.
Okay.
Okay, you've deindustrialised over the last 40 years. Maggie Thatcher made a deliberate choice to go for services.
Yeah.
But services fundamentally are selling debt to other people. So you've lost your industrial base, not as badly as other countries have done, but still substantially. Whereas if you'd been investing, you'd have the physical resources. And to provide pensions for people, you've got to be able to convert money into physical goods and services. So you've got to be producing the physical goods and services as well, which you haven't paid attention to.
Okay.
And you look at the state of British Railway, for example, what a disaster that is. Sewerage, another disaster. So many elements and then industry's declined as well. You know, I used to really enjoy watching a British series when I was a young child called The Plane Makers.
No, never heard of that. Yeah.
Well, you don't make planes anymore, do you?
No.
I mean, so you've deindustrialized massively and focused upon the financial system.
Yeah, services and stuff like that.
Yeah, but the thing is, you need, if you're going to keep pensioners alive, they don't need share certificates.
They don't need share certificates. So who has a good model of this working in the world that you know of, any countries?
Well, the school of thought that I'm part of, called post-Keynesian economics, is much more realistic than the neoclassical.
Yeah. And
there are people working what's called complexity economics as well.
Yeah.
Have got a much more realistic model.
Yeah.
So there are alternative models out there. But we end up being forced to work in minor universities. We don't get published in the leading journals because we're non-neoclassical. So there is a minor group. I've built what I think is a complete system analysing capitalism. And that's my last book, The New Economics and Manifesto, gave you an overview of that. But there is an alternative theory which is realist and which emphasises realism. But it'll never get through the universities because the neoclassicals dominate all the major universities. And to me, my analogy is always, it's like having Ptolemaic astronomers running NASA. You'd never get off the planet, but you'd never get realistic theories through at the same time.
Is there any countries in the world though that do what you've just described?
China is closer to it.
China's
like China. I mean, China's rate of growth has been ridiculous over the last 40 years. And I was actually in China when they built the first free trade zone, and I realised they would grow because the policy they were using was going to work. But they've even surprised me with the scale of industrialisation they've done, and it's largely because that's a country where, whatever you might think about the Communist Party, it's dominated by engineers rather than by economists and lawyers. So consequently, they're all about how do we build this and build that, rather than how do we profit maximize this or legal suits and nonsense like that. So China's dramatically industrialized, dramatically improved the standard of living of their people, but they're also facing the same issue about climate. So they're doing, again, engineering approach. They're doing more to start building alternative energy systems, including nuclear, not just solar, than anywhere else in the world. So China is probably the most effective example.
Thank you so much, Professor Steve Keen. I really enjoyed the conversation. I've learned so much. I think every part of this conversation, I was just learning something. I was like, oh my God, I've never heard that before. Watchers and listeners, I hope that you've enjoyed this. I think this has been a bit of a different one, but it's been very educational for us. And, I want to keep an eye on the climate change stuff because I do hope that doesn't happen. I would hope that people, the leaders of the world maybe some of them could listen to this one day and just, maybe take it seriously, and it kind of doesn't happen. But yeah, if people want to connect to you, I know you got a YouTube channel, you got a podcast, where can they find you?
The main thing is my Patreon page and Substack. So there's patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, and the Substack, it's profstevekeen.substack.com. So those are the two main ones. My posts are all free there. Very much, like exceptions when I've got a book and I'm publishing book chapters that I put behind a paywall. But 99% of my posts are free access. So sign up there, preferably paying me some money because I'm doing all this without my income comes from Substack and Patreon. I'm also running online courses marketed by a company. If you get, I'm not fond of the marketing system, but I'm fond of the people doing the marketing, and they're getting a much more larger audience. So if you get approached about signing up to one of my courses and involves getting a free book, treat it seriously. It's not scam. It's serious.
From you,
You'll get me in courses at the end of it.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, pardon me.
No, excuse you. No worries. Thank you so much. I do appreciate you. And actually, I didn't even say, for the watchers and listeners, Professor Steve does actually live in London. He lives in Amsterdam, but he's in London for a week. So kindly, he decided to give us a bit of his time. So yeah, really, really appreciate you sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, and obviously when you're in London again, definitely want to have a follow-up conversation. And I'll probably ask the watchers and listeners if they've got like any specific questions that they kind of want to go through. But yeah, really appreciate you. Do you have any final words for watchers and listeners?
No, I think we've covered a fair bit of material. I mean, the main thing is don't take economists seriously. And the thing is they believe what they're doing. I saw a wonderful Twitter feed saying, what's a collective word for economists? And the guy said a smug of economists. They're smug. They think they know everything. Don't trust the constrained mainstream economists. Learn the rebels and support rebels because we're not anti-capitalism, we're anti-bad models of capitalism.
Okay. Amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Steve. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of podcast, and see you next week's episode.